They all noticed the women in designer gowns, but the most powerful man in the room couldn't stop watching the one covered in flour. My alarm went off at 2:45 a.m., long before the city remembered how to breathe. By 3:15, the ovens at Carter's Corner Bakery glowed like little suns against the darkness outside, filling the kitchen with the warm scent of butter, vanilla, and fresh bread. Most people imagine luxury began with diamonds and champagne. They never realized it usually started with someone waking up while everyone else was still asleep. I tied my apron around my waist, brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind my ear, and lifted another 50-pound bag of flour onto the stainless steel counter. The muscles in my arms protested, but they had learned this routine years ago. Being plus-size didn't make me weak. If anything, carrying mixers, sacks of flour, and sheet pans every single day had made me stronger than most people expected. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 27 years old, and I own the smallest bakery anyone important had ever accidentally discovered. Most mornings I baked birthday cakes for school teachers, anniversary pies for retired couples, and cinnamon rolls for construction workers who always left generous tips even when they couldn't afford them. Today was different. Today my bakery had landed the biggest order in its 7-year history. A luxury charity gala downtown had requested a 5-tier wedding-style display cake along with nearly 400 handcrafted pastries. The contract wasn't life-changing for people who measured success in millions, but for me it meant paying next month's rent without worrying whether the electric bill could wait another week. It also meant proving that talent could exist inside a tiny neighborhood bakery nobody had heard of yesterday. By 8:30 a.m., every dessert was carefully loaded into my aging delivery van. I checked every box twice before climbing behind the wheel, whispering the same prayer I always did whenever fragile cakes depended on potholes showing mercy. Manhattan greeted me with impatient traffic, endless horns, and sidewalks already crowded with people wearing clothes worth more than my monthly income. The hotel hosting the gala looked less like a building and more like a palace carved from polished marble. Crystal chandeliers sparkled through towering windows, while luxury cars lined the entrance in an endless parade of wealth. I parked beside catering trucks, grabbed my clipboard, and rolled the first dessert cart toward the service entrance. Nobody looked at my cakes first. They looked at me. I recognized those expressions immediately. The quick glance at my size. The polite smile that wasn't really polite. The silent assumption that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly belong inside a ballroom built for magazine covers. A young woman adjusting an elegant silver gown whispered something to another model standing beside her. They both laughed softly before one of them looked directly at me and said, "Guess they're letting anyone deliver desserts now." I smiled anyway, not because it didn't sting, but because arguing had never made bread rise or people kinder. I simply kept pushing my cart through the enormous kitchen, carefully checking every pastry one last time. Buttercream didn't care what size I wore. Chocolate never judged anybody. Flour never asked whether I belonged. As I placed the final cake beneath its spotlight in the grand ballroom, I heard something outside that changed the atmosphere in an instant. Conversations faded. Security radios crackled. Luxury sedans stopped moving. Someone near the entrance whispered only 4 words. And suddenly every head turned toward the front doors. "Vincent Romano is here." The ballroom seemed to inhale all at once. I had never believed silence could sound expensive until that moment. Forks stopped clinking against porcelain. Conversations dissolved into whispers. Even the musicians lowered their instruments for a heartbeat as the enormous front doors opened. I could not see the entrance from behind the towering display cake, but I did not need to. Every person in the room was suddenly looking in the same direction. Curiosity pulled me forward just enough to catch a glimpse between crystal centerpieces and elegantly dressed guests. He was taller than I expected, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that looked simple until the light caught its impossibly fine fabric. His dark hair was neatly combed back, revealing calm gray eyes that moved through the ballroom with quiet precision. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply walked, and somehow the room adjusted itself around him. People stepped aside before he reached them, not because anyone asked them to, but because they already knew. Vincent Romano carried authority the way ordinary people carried umbrellas in the rain. Naturally, effortlessly. A woman standing beside me leaned closer to another caterer. Every magazine said he was bringing a different model tonight. The other woman nodded without taking her eyes off him. Look at them. They have been waiting for him all evening. I followed her gaze toward the grand staircase where several breathtaking women stood in designer gowns that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. They looked like they belonged on movie posters, every hairstyle perfect, every smile carefully rehearsed. Cameras flashed as photographers hurried toward the entrance, hoping to capture the next headline before anyone else. I quietly returned my attention to the dessert table. The raspberry glaze on one tart had shifted slightly during delivery. It bothered me more than the whispers filling the ballroom. I reached for a small offset spatula and gently corrected the edge until it reflected the overhead lights exactly the way I wanted. Precision always calmed me. Flour had taught me that tiny details separated something ordinary from something unforgettable. Excuse me. A sharp voice interrupted my concentration. I looked up to find the event coordinator frowning at me. We have photographers everywhere now. Please stay behind the service doors unless someone calls for you. I nodded politely. Of course. She did not thank me. She was already walking away before I finished speaking. I gathered a few empty pastry trays and headed toward the kitchen, passing groups of guests discussing investments, luxury vacations, and exclusive charities. Nobody noticed the woman carrying the trays. That was perfectly fine with me. Invisible people often saw the most. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was completely different. Dishwashers hummed. Ovens released bursts of warm air. Servers rushed past balancing silver trays with practiced confidence. One young dishwasher looked exhausted as he struggled to lift a heavy container onto a shelf. Without thinking, I set down my trays and helped him slide it into place. Thank you, he said, breathing hard. I did not think I was going to get that up there. We all need an extra pair of hands sometimes. I answered with a smile before checking that every dessert waiting for service was still perfect. A few minutes later, one of the pastry chefs hurried, overlooking pale. Emily, he whispered, the centerpiece cake is leaning. My heart skipped. I turned instantly toward the ballroom entrance. If that cake collapsed in front of 400 guests, it would not matter who had walked through those front doors. Everyone would remember only one disaster. My feet were already moving before my mind finished processing the words. The centerpiece cake stood beneath a circle of crystal chandeliers at the center of the ballroom, beautiful from a distance but terrifying up close. One side had begun to sink ever so slightly, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I knew because I had spent 14 hours building it by hand. A support rod had shifted during transport. If the weight continued to settle, the entire upper section would slowly slide out of alignment. It would not explode into disaster. It would simply collapse with the quiet certainty of gravity, and every guest in the room would watch months of preparation disappear in seconds. I set my tool bag on the floor and took one slow breath. Panic had never fixed a cake. Steady hands had. Can you save it? The pastry chef whispered. Give me 5 minutes, I answered. And please keep everyone away from this table. He nodded and hurried off to redirect the serving staff. I carefully lifted a layer no heavier than 15 pounds, sliding a hidden support back into place while smoothing the buttercream before anyone nearby noticed. My heartbeat echoed louder than the orchestra. Tiny details mattered now. 1. Uneven movement would make everything worse. Around me, the gala continued with polished elegance. Guests laughed over sparkling glasses. Cameras flashed across the ballroom. Nobody seemed aware that only a few feet away someone was trying to prevent the evening's centerpiece from becoming its greatest embarrassment. Do you need another spatula? A quiet voice asked behind me. I turned to find the young dishwasher from earlier, holding out exactly the tool I had been searching for. I smiled. You just saved me 30 seconds. You helped me first, he replied with a nervous grin before disappearing back into the kitchen. Kindness always seemed to find its way home. I adjusted the final support, stepped back, then leaned in once more to smooth a tiny imperfection where the frosting reflected the light unevenly. There, balanced again. Stable. Breathing finally returned to my lungs. It is fixed. I whispered more to myself than anyone else. A ripple of relieved applause came from the catering staff, standing discreetly near the service doors. They knew how close we had come. Most of the guests never would, and honestly, that was exactly how it should be. The best work usually went unnoticed. I gathered my tools and turned to leave when I sensed someone watching me. Not the quick glance of a curious guest. Not the dismissive stare I had grown used to over the years. This was steady, intentional. I looked across the ballroom. Vincent Romano stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline, speaking with several executives dressed in tailored suits. One man was explaining something with animated gestures, but Vincent was not looking at him. His gray eyes were fixed on the cake. No, on me. Our eyes met for only a second before I looked away, convinced I had imagined it. Why would someone like him pay attention to the baker when the room was filled with celebrities, philanthropists, and women whose photographs appeared on billboards across Manhattan? I picked up my tool bag and headed toward the kitchen, refusing to let my imagination run wild. As I reached the service doors, I heard another voice behind me. Calm, deep, unhurried. Who made that cake? The ballroom fell strangely quiet again. I stopped walking without meaning to. The event coordinator answered almost immediately. A local bakery, Mr. Romano. There was a brief pause before he asked one more question, softer than the first, yet somehow impossible to ignore. What is her name? The event coordinator glanced toward the kitchen before answering. Her name is Emily Carter. She owns the bakery that prepared every dessert tonight. I did not wait to hear anything else. The service doors swung shut behind me, replacing the elegant music of the ballroom with the familiar sounds of timers beeping, mixers humming, and cooks calling orders across stainless steel counters. That world made sense to me. Measurements made sense. Recipes made sense. People rarely did. Emily, thank goodness. One of the banquet servers hurried toward me carrying an empty silver tray. The staff meal is running late again. Half the servers have not eaten since this morning. I looked toward the prep table where several young employees quietly drank water while pretending they were not hungry. They still smiled whenever guests passed through the kitchen, but exhaustion was beginning to show in their eyes. I opened one of the pastry boxes that held extra croissants and fruit danishes prepared in case of unexpected guests. We had plenty left. More than enough. Take these, I said, placing fresh pastries on his serving plates. Everyone deserves to eat before the speeches begin. The server hesitated. The event manager said these are only for the guests. I smiled gently. Then do not tell her where they came from. A few minutes later, the kitchen felt lighter. Someone laughed for the first time all evening. A dishwasher thanked me with a warm chocolate chip cookie tucked carefully into his apron pocket. One of the line cooks bit into a cinnamon roll and closed his eyes as though he had almost forgotten what warm food tasted like. None of them knew I had quietly added the extra pastries to the invoice weeks ago without charging the event. My grandmother used to tell me that hungry people remembered kindness longer than expensive decorations. She had built our bakery on that belief, and after she passed away, I promised myself I never would not let that tradition disappear. Through the small glass window separating the kitchen from the ballroom, I could see photographers circling the celebrity guests like birds following sunlight. Several glamorous women gracefully approached Vincent Romano one after another, each wearing a different designer gown, each carrying herself with effortless confidence. They smiled. They laughed. They posed naturally whenever another camera pointed their way. Vincent remained perfectly courteous, but something felt strangely distant about him. He listened more than he spoke. He shook hands. He thanked people. Yet every few moments, his attention drifted somewhere beyond the conversations surrounding him. I assumed he was thinking about business. Men with responsibilities like his probably always were. I certainly never imagined his eyes occasionally settled on the kitchen doors instead. Emily. I turned as the pastry chef approached again, this time smiling. The guests cannot stop talking about your desserts. I laughed softly. That is nice to hear. No, he replied, shaking his head. You do not understand. They are asking who made them. Before I could answer, one of the event assistants rushed inside carrying a tablet. We need another dessert display in the East Reception Lounge. Some unexpected VIP guests have arrived. I can put one together, I offered immediately. We loaded fresh pastries onto elegant serving stands, arranging each tart, eclair, and cookie with careful attention. I adjusted a single strawberry that leaned slightly to one side. Details mattered even when nobody noticed them. As I lifted the finished display onto the service cart, I heard applause erupt from the ballroom, followed by the familiar voice of the master of ceremonies welcoming everyone to the evening's charity celebration. Taking one steady breath, I pushed the cart through the side entrance. unaware that across the room Vincent Romano had quietly excused himself from another conversation the exact moment he saw me appear again. I had barely rolled the dessert cart into the East Reception Lounge when the atmosphere changed again, although this time it had nothing to do with elegant speeches or camera flashes. A woman holding her phone at arm's length slowly walked around the pastry display while streaming live to thousands of followers. Her designer dress shimmered beneath the chandeliers, and every sentence seemed carefully chosen for the audience watching from behind their screens. "This place is absolutely stunning," she said with a polished smile before her eyes landed on me arranging a tray of lemon tarts. She paused just long enough for the camera to follow her gaze. "Well, I guess not everything tonight is picture perfect." A few people nearby laughed politely. I pretended not to notice. Years of working behind bakery counters had taught me that some opinions deserved less attention than burnt cookies. I adjusted another tart, making certain every blueberry sat exactly where it belonged. The woman stepped closer. "Tell me," she continued while still filming, "do they let the staff sample everything? Because that would explain a lot." More laughter drifted through the room. My hand stopped for only a second before continuing their work. Buttercream still needed smoothing. Powdered sugar still needed dusting. My grandmother always said that dignity sounded quieter than cruelty, but it lasted much longer. "Your pastries do look amazing," another guest added awkwardly, trying to ease the tension. "They are beautiful," I replied with a genuine smile. "I hope everyone enjoys them." That answer seemed to disappoint the woman more than any argument could have. She waited for embarrassment. She waited for anger. Instead, I offered one of the miniature fruit tarts to an elderly hotel employee, quietly passing through with fresh linens. "You have been working just as hard as the rest of us," I said. "Please enjoy your break." The older woman blinked in surprise before accepting it with grateful hands. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her voice carried more warmth than the applause filling the ballroom next door. The live stream continued anyway. I could hear comments being read aloud as hearts floated across the phone screen. Some were kind, others were not. I chose not to. Look, words on a screen had never needed dough or paid rent. They only disappeared when someone scrolled away. A few minutes later, the woman lost interest and wandered toward another group of celebrities, searching for a better story. I released a slow breath without realizing I had been holding it. "You handled that well." I turned to find the young dishwasher standing beside the service entrance carrying another stack of clean plates. "I wanted to say something," he admitted, "but I did not know if I should." "Sometimes silence protects more than arguments," I answered, "and sometimes kindness speaks louder than both." He nodded thoughtfully before returning to work. As I lifted another tray onto the display, I noticed movement reflected in the polished silver serving stand. Across the reception lounge, Vincent Romano had quietly entered without photographers following him. No announcement, no entourage crowding around him. He was not looking toward the celebrities gathered beneath the crystal lights. He was watching the elderly employee smile as she enjoyed the fruit tart I had handed her only moments earlier. His expression did not change, but something thoughtful settled behind his gray eyes. He thanked the businessman speaking beside him without appearing to hear a single word. Then, for the first time that evening, he changed direction completely and began walking toward the dessert display where I stood, completely unaware that every confident step was about to change the course of a night I thought would end like every other catering job. Vincent Romano stopped a few feet from the dessert display, close enough for me to notice the faint scent of cedarwood and fresh linen instead of the expensive cologne I had expected. The conversations around us continued, but they sounded farther away now, softened by the quiet confidence he carried with him. I quickly wiped a trace of powdered sugar from the edge of the serving table and offered the same polite smile I gave every guest. "Good evening. Would you like to try the lemon tart or the salted caramel eclair?" His gray eyes moved across the display before returning to me. "Which one would you choose?" The question caught me off guard. Most guests asked which dessert cost the most to make or which one looked best in photographs. Nobody had ever asked what I would choose. "The apple hand pie," I answered honestly, pointing toward the corner of the display. "It is simple, but it reminds me of home." He looked at the small pastry resting quietly beside rows of elaborate desserts. "Then I will have the apple hand pie." I placed it carefully on a dessert plate and handed it to him. "I hope you enjoy it." Before he could answer, The same influencer from earlier approached with several guests following behind her. Her phone was no longer streaming, but her smile still seemed designed for an invisible audience. "Mr. Romano," she said brightly, "you finally escaped all those business conversations." She glanced at the pastry in his hand, then toward me. "Surely you are not skipping the chef's signature desserts for that little pie." Vincent looked down at the pastry for a brief moment before calmly replying, "Someone recommended it." "Really?" She laughed lightly. "I would have thought you preferred something a little more refined." The remark floated through the room just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. I lowered my eyes toward the serving trays and quietly adjusted a folded napkin that did not actually need adjusting. There was nothing new about becoming the subject of someone else's joke. What surprised me was the silence that followed. Vincent neither smiled nor laughed. Instead, he took a small bite of the apple hand pie and remained thoughtful for several seconds. Finally, he nodded once. "This tastes like someone made it because they wanted people to feel welcome." The influencer blinked, unsure how to respond. "Well, presentation matters too." "Presentation brought everyone to this table," Vincent answered calmly. "Care is what will make them remember it tomorrow." No one spoke. The nearby conversations seemed to fade again as guests exchanged uncertain glances. His voice had never become louder. It simply carried the kind of quiet certainty that did not require repeating. He turned back toward me. "Did you bake this yourself?" "Yes," I answered. "Everything here came from my bakery." "Including the centerpiece cake?" "Yes." "And you repaired it earlier this evening." I felt my eyebrows lift slightly. I did not realize anyone noticed. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth for the first time that evening. Most people were watching the room. His eyes met mine with calm sincerity. I was watching the person who refused to let the room fall apart. Before I could think of a reply, the master of ceremonies announced that all guests should gather in the grand ballroom for the evening's featured presentation. People began moving toward the main hall, but Vincent remained exactly where he was for one quiet moment longer. Then he looked at me and asked a question no guest had ever asked before. "Miss Carter, after the presentation, would you allow me to learn the story behind your bakery?" For a moment, I forgot the music, the guests, and the hundreds of sparkling lights hanging above us. I simply looked at him, convinced I had misunderstood the question. Men like Vincent Romano did not ask strangers about their dreams. They usually asked assistants to schedule meetings, lawyers to review contracts, or reporters to leave them alone. Yet there he stood, waiting patiently for my answer as though the busiest man in the ballroom suddenly had nowhere more important to be. I smiled politely. "It is not a very exciting story. The best ones rarely begin that way," he replied. Before I could say anything else, the event coordinator hurried toward me with visible panic. "Emily, we need another dessert station immediately. The East Lounge is nearly empty." I nodded without hesitation. "I will take care of it." Vincent stepped aside, giving me room to push the service cart past him. "Duty first," he said quietly. "I respect that." I offered a grateful smile before returning to work. The ballroom had reached its busiest moment of the evening. Every table was full. Waiters moved gracefully between guests carrying polished silver trays, while photographers searched for perfect angles beneath the crystal chandeliers. I focused on what I knew best, arranging desserts one careful plate at a time. My hands found their rhythm again. Fresh berries, mint leaves, powdered sugar. Every small detail mattered because someone celebrating tonight deserved something made with care. Across the room, I occasionally noticed Vincent speaking with donors, community leaders, and business executives. Every conversation looked important, yet none of them seemed to hold his attention for very long. More than once I caught him quietly glancing toward the dessert displays before returning to whoever was standing in front of him. Meanwhile, several elegant women continued approaching him throughout the evening. One invited him to an upcoming charity gala. Another complimented his tailored suit. A third attempted to introduce him to a fashion photographer waiting nearby. Vincent remained perfectly respectful with each conversation, offering polite smiles and brief replies before naturally excusing himself. There was no arrogance in the way he carried himself. If anything, he seemed surprisingly comfortable listening instead of speaking. I had just finished replacing a tray of chocolate eclairs when I noticed one of the hotel's maintenance workers standing near the hallway entrance. His uniform sleeve was stained with dust, and he looked embarrassed as he stared toward the dessert table before quickly looking away. Perhaps he thought the food was reserved only for distinguished guests. Without drawing attention, I picked up a small plate, arranged 2 pastries and a warm dinner roll, then quietly walked over to him. "You have been working all evening too," I said. "Please enjoy these while they are still fresh." His eyes widened. "Ma'am, I cannot accept food meant for the guests. Tonight you helped make this event possible," I answered gently. "That makes you part of tonight as well." He accepted the plate with both hands. "Thank you. Nobody has ever said that to me before." I returned to the dessert station without expecting anyone else to notice. But someone had. From across the ballroom, Vincent had paused in the middle of another conversation. The executive standing beside him continued explaining financial projections, pointing toward a presentation screen. Yet Vincent's attention rested on the maintenance worker quietly enjoying his meal with a grateful smile. A thoughtful expression settled over his face, deeper than curiosity now, as though he had finally found the answer to a question he had been asking himself all evening. Several minutes later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the main stage and invited the evening's principal sponsor to join him. The applause began before the name was even announced. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host declared with a broad smile, "please welcome Mr. Vincent Romano." Instead of walking directly toward the stage, Vincent turned, looked across the crowded ballroom until our eyes met once again, and changed direction. The applause continued echoing through the ballroom, but Vincent Romano did not step onto the stage. Instead, he walked calmly across the polished marble floor toward the dessert display, where I stood frozen with a serving towel still folded in my hands. Confused whispers spread faster than the applause itself. Even the master of ceremonies hesitated, uncertain whether to continue the introduction. Vincent stopped in front of me, his expression as composed as it had been all evening. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the guests nearby to hear. "Would you walk with me?" I blinked in surprise. "I think they are waiting for you." A faint smile appeared again. "They can wait another few seconds." Every nearby conversation faded into silence. Cameras slowly turned away from celebrities and toward us instead. I suddenly became aware of the flour still dusting one sleeve of my black uniform, despite my efforts to brush it away earlier. My shoes were comfortable work shoes, not elegant heels. My apron had already been removed, but there was no hiding that I belonged behind the kitchen doors rather than beneath the ballroom chandeliers. "I should stay with the desserts," I answered quietly. "They still need someone watching them." Vincent looked briefly across the display before meeting my eyes again. "From everything I have seen tonight, I believe they are in very capable hands." Before I could find another excuse, the event coordinator hurried over, looking uncertain. "Mr. Romano, everyone is ready for your remarks." "Excellent," he replied calmly. "Then let us not keep them waiting." He gestured politely toward the stage, inviting me to walk beside him. I hesitated only a moment before following, more because refusing in front of hundreds of guests felt impossible than because I understood what was happening. Every step toward the stage seemed louder than the orchestra. I could feel curious eyes following us from every corner of the ballroom. Some guests smiled with interest. Others looked completely bewildered. The influencer from earlier lowered her phone for perhaps the first time all evening, her confident expression replaced by genuine confusion. When we reached the stage, Vincent stepped to the microphone while I quietly remained several feet away, hoping to disappear into the background. Instead, he turned slightly toward me before addressing the room. "Tonight we gathered to celebrate generosity," he began. "Many people believe generosity begins with wealth. I used to think that as well." The ballroom grew perfectly still. This evening I watched remarkable decorations, extraordinary fashion, and impressive conversations. They all deserve appreciation. He paused briefly, but I also watched someone repair a problem before anyone noticed it existed. I watched her feed employees who had not found time to eat. I watched her thank people whose names most guests will never learn. I watched her choose kindness every single time nobody expected recognition. His words settled over the room more quietly than applause ever could. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reached for another drink. Vincent continued, his voice calm and steady. "Character reveals itself when there is no audience." He glanced toward me once more. "Tonight, I found the person who best represents the purpose of this event." My heart pounded so loudly I wondered whether the microphone might somehow capture it. I shook my head almost instinctively. "Please," I whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear. "I only did my job," he answered just as softly. "No, Miss Carter, you did much more than that." Then, turning back toward the audience, he made one simple request that no one in the ballroom had expected. "Before I continue my remarks, I would like everyone here to give Emily Carter the applause she never asked for but completely earned." For a few seconds I could not hear anything except my own heartbeat. Then the applause began. It started with a few people near the front tables, spread across the ballroom one row at a time, and soon every guest was standing. Crystal glasses reflected hundreds of moving hands while the sound filled every corner of the room. I wanted to disappear behind the nearest serving cart. Instead, I stood there completely speechless, my eyes burning with emotions I had worked very hard to hide for years. Nobody had ever applauded me for waking up before sunrise. Nobody had applauded me for kneading dough until my shoulders ached or cleaning flour from bakery floors long after everyone else had gone home. They had simply expected the bread to be warm and the cakes to be beautiful. Tonight, for the first time in my life, someone had noticed the person behind them. When the applause finally softened, Vincent stepped away from the microphone and looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn since the beginning of the evening. "Thank you for reminding us why we came here tonight," he said quietly. I shook my head with a nervous smile. "I think you gave me far more credit than I deserve." "No," he answered. "I simply gave everyone else the opportunity to notice what I noticed." Before I could respond, another round of applause rose through the ballroom. This time it felt warmer, less formal. Several members of the catering staff smiled toward me. The young dishwasher proudly clapped harder than anyone. The maintenance worker I had offered pastries to earlier lifted his plate slightly in my direction before joining the applause again. Even the event coordinator, who had barely looked at me all afternoon, offered a sincere smile as I stepped down from the stage. The evening slowly returned to its elegant rhythm, but something invisible had changed. Guests no longer walked past the dessert displays without stopping. They asked questions about the bakery. They wanted to know where it was located, how long I had been baking, and which pastry I recommended. Some requested business cards. Others quietly thanked me for the desserts before leaving. The influencer who had mocked me earlier approached with hesitant steps, her confident smile replaced by something much more human. "Emily," she said softly, "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I am sorry." I smiled gently because carrying resentment had always felt heavier than carrying flour. "I hope you enjoyed the desserts." She laughed awkwardly. "The apple hand pie was incredible. That one is my grandmother's recipe. Would you mind if I visited your bakery someday? Everyone is welcome." She nodded gratefully before walking away. Nearly 6 months later, the bell above my bakery door rang at exactly 5 o'clock on another quiet morning. The sky outside was still painted in shades of blue and gray, and the first cinnamon rolls had only just come out of the oven. I expected one of my regular construction workers. Instead, Vincent Romano stepped inside wearing a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, and carrying no photographers, no grand entrance, and no need to impress anyone. He smiled as the warm scent of fresh bread filled the room. "Good morning, Miss Carter." I laughed softly. "You are here very early. You once told me the best things begin before the world wakes up." I handed him a clean apron. "Can you bake?" He looked down at the apron before meeting my eyes again. "I suppose there is only one way to find out." He spent the next hour trying to shape bread dough that stubbornly refused to cooperate, leaving flour across the counter and somehow on his sleeves as well. We laughed more than we talked. When the first customers arrived, they did not see the influential man the newspapers admired. They simply saw someone learning something new beside a neighborhood baker. Standing there with warm bread cooling beside the window, I finally understood something my grandmother had always believed. Beauty may capture someone's attention for a moment, but kindness, humility, and quiet character are what make a person impossible to forget.